God's atonement was universal in scope. He desired that all be saved and none perish. Does it follow from a universal atonement that universal salvation is true? Many Christians, including scholars and theologians, have argued for centuries that it does not. But how reasonable is such a position? Is it a coherent notion to simultaneously hold that God's atonement is universal while also believing in a non-universalist eschatology? I am convinced that such a position, when properly understood, entails a contradiction. How? Well, through an argument that I've called the argument against universal atonement and the unsavable. I've given a version of this argument in former videos and hinted at it as well, but now I want to make the argument as clear as possible. First, we must establish some terms. 1. Omniscient. When I use the word, I intend for it to mean that if one possesses omniscience, that he has the power of foreknowledge. An omniscient being would foreknow all things that occur in the real world prior to the actualization in the real world. I would also include that this being has middle knowledge, which is to say that not only does he foreknow what actually happens in the real world, but he also knows all counterfactuals. That is to say, this being knows what a person would have chosen in any given instance, but these possibilities are not actualized in the real world. 2. The savable. To be saved means that God foreknows a person will, in a definite sense, accept salvation. 3. The unsavable. Someone that is unsavable is someone who God foreknows will definitely reject him in an ultimate sense. Now to the argument. Premise 1. God is omniscient. Premise 2. Some people are unsavable. Premise 3. The unsavable will never respond to a provision of grace. Premise 4. A provision of grace towards someone implies said person is savable. Premise 5. A universal provision of grace entails that all who are included in such a provision are savable. Premise 6. If universal atonement is true, then universal salvation is true. Conclusion: universal salvation is true. I anticipate the vast majority of objections will come from premise 4. The rest of the premises, as far as I'm aware, are uncontroversial, so I'll defend the validity of premise 4. I'll start with an example that perhaps proves this premise. Let's say that God creates the universe, and the universe that is actualized contains no human being that is savable. Remember, being savable means that you will accept the provision of grace ultimately. So in this universe, all humans are unsavable, meaning all of them would reject the provision of grace and finality in every circumstance. To then offer a provision of grace in this possible world would then constitute a meaningless end in doing so. It would be an act with no clear rationale behind it, and therefore would be an incoherent action. An act of a rational will must involve some rationale to your actions. In order for an act to be rational, one must know what one is choosing and why. To choose to offer universal atonement in a world which does not comprise a totality of savable people is incoherent. But the same logic would apply even if one person was unsavable. If persons are unsavable, then it would be an incoherent action to offer salvation to them. It is reasonable, however, to offer universal provision of grace if everyone in the actual world is savable. If not, then the only way that a provision of grace could be coherent is if it is limited in scope to those God foreknew would accept it. We have established that an all-knowing being presenting universal atonement to a world that contains unsavable persons is logically incoherent. But if omniscience, universal atonement, and the unsavable are incompatible ideas, then an all-knowing God that actualizes universal atonement with the knowledge that the world contains unsavable persons, then it does damage to most Christians' idea of God. Universal provisional grace is a statement of fact that one is savable, and the unsavable exists in the actualized world will entail a contradiction. To affirm both statements is to affirm a contradiction. Both A and non-A cannot be true at the same time in the same world. Therefore, if God affirms these two statements, God has affirmed a contradiction. If God possesses no contradictions in his nature, then God cannot affirm both propositions as being true in the same world. If God has affirmed universal atonement, then logically he has done so with the knowledge that universal salvation is true. There are ways to get around the argument, and one would be to deny premise 1, God's omniscience, and instead affirm open theism, which is to claim that God does not possess foreknowledge in every given situation. This saves the belief in universal atonement for the very reason that God does not know everything. Him offering universal atonement would then make sense in this situation because he would never know who will or who will not reject grace, nor would he know the scope. God's justification in such a situation is like this. A man is trapped in a building that is on fire and will collapse at any moment. You offer him help to escape the building, but the man refuses your help. Yet you are determined to plead with this man until the very last second because he could always change his mind. Sadly, he does not change his mind. But you are rational within that situation because you were not aware of the future, and so you had reason to hope that he changes his mind. On open theism, that is how God would reconcile the affirmation of universal atonement and the possibility or reality of eternal loss. Another way to get around the argument and yet maintain God's omniscience would be to deny universal atonement in favor of a form of limited atonement. God would restrict his offer of grace only to those whom he knows will accept it. In my closing, I hope that I've adequately shown universal atonement and omniscient God paired with the reality of eternal loss are incompatible propositions, and one must either reject God's omniscience or universal atonement. But one thing that I haven't pointed out is that God's omniscience paired with universal atonement only happens if God is with 100% certainty knows that all will be saved. So a quick critique of what is called hopeful universalism will do here. Hopeful universalism states that we can't be certain that God will save everyone, so in a posture of humility, we don't presume that he will, nor do we presume that he won't. His position acknowledges the true possibility of what I have called people being unsavable. If my argument holds up, to doubt the final universal salvation of all people would be possibly to affirm a contradiction in God's nature, because universal atonement being a true proposition paired with some human beings in the category of unsavable also being a true proposition is contradictory. If God has offered universal provision, then we are well within our rights to stand certain that all are and will be ultimately saved. Thanks for watching.